Listeners, just a quick reminder before we get going that if you are a regular consumer of this podcast, you will love The Week magazine, your weekly digest of the best news, reviews and columns from more than 200 UK and international sources. Multiple perspectives and a unique overview of the most important topics and the most entertaining stories. And just for listening to this show, you can get your first 12 issues for just £12 and a free moleskin notebook. Go to theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code POD12. That's theweek.co.uk/offer and the promo code POD12. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 11th of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen an escalating conflict between Iran and the US, the BAFTAs criticised for a lack of diversity in their nominations, and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex announcing they're stepping back as senior royals. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Gabriel, Power and Kari, Wilkin, and the boss man, Holden Frith, who is up first. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
It's the week we learned we're only 3/4 of the men we used to be.
I tested a stunt man in a movie set once, and he came out low in testosterone, was terribly unhappy about being low in testosterone. The fact is he still was a stunt man and did all the work that other people couldn't do. So he shouldn't have been focusing upon that testosterone. I think to focus upon the testosterone is the wrong thing to do.
Now, when you tried to convince him that he shouldn't feel bad about it, did he find that persuasive at all?
No, he was just unhappy.
Hell of a baritone on that man. James Dabbs of Georgia State University, author of Heroes, Rogues and Lovers, Testosterone and Behaviour, speaking on This American Life. Holden, what's happened this week?
Well, the background to this is we've known for some time that testosterone levels are in decline, and that in individual men, as they get older, their own testosterone levels tend to fall. But the news this week comes from a study published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine, which puts some numbers on this. It looked at men between the ages of 15 and 39 and found that they now have 25% less testosterone than they did 20 years ago. So that's a pretty stark fall in just 2 decades.
That is astonishing. I mean, it's not just a few percent where you could say, it's in the margin of error or something. That is a marked decline. Yeah. What do they think is causing it then?
There's lots of theories, but no real consensus. I think the clearest factor is probably diet. Obesity tends to lead to lower testosterone levels, and that will account for some of that fall, but probably only about a fifth. Even men who have a healthy body mass index now have 20% less testosterone than their equivalents 20 years ago.
And so this is going to play very strongly, isn't it, into the male rights activists, we've all been neutered, we're all manginas now brigade. Is there some science then behind that paranoia? Men's masculinity is actually declining, or is that overblown anyway, and testosterone isn't what makes men manly?
It's really complicated, and I think what makes this an interesting story is it does start out as a sort of scientific story and a health story, because there are health consequences of having low testosterone, but it very quickly becomes about identity and society. And there are some links there, but it's not always clear what's cause and what's effect, because testosterone is what tends to make men more aggressive, more competitive, more focused, but also being active and doing traditional masculine things like physical labour tends to increase levels of testosterone too. So there is a bit of an untangling that needs to be done to work out exactly what's going on.
Okay, so if it is just basically that society's got a bit fatter and men generally are doing less physical work, that's not necessarily something to concern us, is it, Kari?
I think there's a slight or a lack of comprehension about just how many effects testosterone has on the body. We all link it to sex drive and aggression. It has myriad health effects. It affects memory, spatial reasoning, energy, bone health, and a deficiency has been linked to various health problems, including depression, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes. I mean, the list goes on and on. For example, with the weight gain issue, yes, weight gain has been found to reduce levels of testosterone, but conversely, a lack of testosterone creates fatigue. So it's very difficult to separate cause and effect in this whole debate, which makes it, very difficult to look at in terms of scientifically the causes and also then the social implications.
And those side effects aren't discussed much in the public sphere, are they, Gabriel? The one that springs to mind is Robbie Williams. His wife claimed that his depression or anxiety in his 30s was caused by a lack of testosterone. But it's not something that, we're talking about young men here, men up to 39, Holden said. It's not something that men generally sort of diagnose for each other, is it? You're feeling a bit under the weather, maybe you need a testosterone injection.
Well, I think the clip that we heard at the beginning is emblematic of the discourse around testosterone and the fact that a lot of men seemingly put too much emphasis on it. I mean, obviously, there might be a correlation between testosterone shortages and depression or something like that, but I'm sure there are other ways of, recovering from depression or treating depression that don't involve just throwing testosterone into your system.
Yeah, but of course, but when there's a physical imbalance and that's the cause, that could be life-changing.
But I don't know. Like, the only thing is, I wonder if it is purely, as Kari was saying, just correlation as opposed to causation, because there are so many conflicting ideas about what testosterone deficiencies do and don't do and how that can affect your livelihood and your life and your health. It's probably not for me to say, but I find it hard to trust a lot of these studies that say this, because like one of the things is that certain forms of close relationships such as marriage, fatherhood and increased time spent with children are causally linked to lower testosterone levels.
Yeah, pro-social hormones such as oxytocin have been found to actually reduce levels of testosterone. So there is an argument that, yes, sort of men playing a greater role in family life could, in fact, be reducing their manliness in this sense, if you're measuring it in terms of testosterone.
I mean, I suppose testosterone affects the way you feel, doesn't it, Holden, for men and women? And actually, if there are men whose lives have been turned around by taking more testosterone or boosting their testosterone, I mean, in a way, it doesn't matter, does it, if there's a direct link? The point is they feel different about themselves, and that has impacted other elements of their life, and it's their truth.
Yeah, and it's probably quite difficult to separate a placebo effect as well. There's a lot going on. The medical establishment, if we can call it that, is a bit uneasy talking about this, precisely because it does tend to get connected with ideas of identity as much as measurable health. So there are people who have clinically low testosterone levels. There's a lot of disagreement about what that level is, but those are the kind of people who most doctors will say they should take testosterone supplements and they will see a big, measurable, substantial increase in the quality of their lives. But then there's a lot of people who, they may take it as a way of gaining muscle mass, and so they're treating it almost like a steroid, as a way of artificially, or a way of taking a shortcut to getting the body that they want, or even getting the results they want at work. They might think that I'm more likely to get that promotion if I have a higher level of testosterone.
Yeah, and that whole kind of go get it tiger thing is what lies behind football coaches, isn't it? Telling their squad not to have sex for a week before they play in the big final. It's this idea that if you're loaded with more testosterone, you're more likely to go out there and feel aggressive and try and claim the prize.
Well, what's ironic is that actual sexual activity has been found to increase testosterone levels. That's the thing. A lot of these things that you think might increase testosterone levels are actually quite counterintuitive. Like, for example, chemical pollutants have been found to have a big effect on testosterone levels generally, lowering them. But in fact, smoking can lead to acute increases, which sounds counterintuitive because you would think that it would be damaging. So in fact, one effect of the reduction in the number of people smoking could have been this drop in testosterone.
Okay, so it's perhaps a tobacco influence artificial high in testosterone levels when they first started measuring it.
Yes, if you want to be manly, just light up.
That's not an opinion.
I'm not
endorsed
saying
by
that.
the
I'm
week.
not
It's
saying
not
that.
medically sanctioned advice.
But some of the other theories are really quite surprising. So there's the one hypothesis, the reduction is caused by offices and homes becoming warmer because heat generally discourages testosterone production, and also the fashion for tighter underwear. Maybe that's been blamed in the past for lower sperm counts, but it may also be responsible for falling testosterone levels.
I also wrote a great anecdote about a 2004 study by Italian researchers that found that men who were in love had lower testosterone levels than non-loved-up men. So maybe we're all just in love.
Also, I've seen a neuroscientist explain testosterone as a hormone that will make someone do whatever they need to protect their status. Perhaps this is a good thing, that men just don't feel they need to protect their status as much anymore.
Maybe. I remember reading one description of testosterone that said it is linked to sexual aggression. a reduction of that among some men in society would probably be a good thing. But it also, it plays into that whole kind of atrophied view of men that men's rights activists, or like masculinity that men's rights activists and like parts of the alt-right have about if your testosterone is low, it makes you not a man or not as much of a man, and that if you want to gain muscle mass or you want to do this or you want to do that and do things that are more manly, you just take testosterone and that's it. I mean, it's so much more complicated than that. Every facet of human life is more complicated than that. The way they reduced it to this ridiculous, simple notion is just not correct.
That said, though, if these statistics continue to slide, might it be, do you think, Holden, that in the future male hormone replacement therapy becomes as much common currency as female HRT?
Yeah, prescriptions in the UK have risen by 20% since 2012 and in the US by much more than that. And it should be said that low testosterone does have serious health implications, including increased rates of testicular cancer. But there are also health risks associated with testosterone replacement therapy treatment, including high risk of heart attack and stroke.
It's also quite expensive. Testosterone replacement therapy, or TRT, costs about up to £28 a month, which I don't know how many health authorities are going to be willing to pay that, and obviously a lot of individuals be able to afford to fund it.
OK, next up, it's Kari after this. OK, Kari, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Should protecting animals be a protected belief?
This hearing is going to be very important for all the vegans around the world, because this is the first time that a country legally kind of accept that veganism is such an important belief that needs to be protected. And of course, vegans are the same everywhere in the world. The animals are the same everywhere in the world. Discrimination is the same everywhere in the world. So that will be good news, because they know if it happened here, it could happen there as well. And I expect that will be more cases in other countries where similar situations than mine will end up in court and will end up also protecting veganism, because veganism deserves to be protected.
That was Jordi Kazimichana speaking outside an employment tribunal court last Friday. Kari, what was he on about?
So Jordi Kazimichana is a vegan. He's an ethical vegan, and he's claiming that he was unfairly sacked by his employer, the League Against Cruel Sports, on the basis of his veganism, after telling colleagues that the animal welfare charity was investing its pension funds in firms involved in animal testing. The League says he was fired on the grounds of gross misconduct, and that aspect of the case is yet to be heard. It's going to be considered at a tribunal in February, so we should probably steer clear of that.
OK, but that's separate from him pointing out where the pension money was then?
It's all mixed up. The company is saying it's confidential as to exactly why he was sacked, so that's unclear. And as I say, the tribunal's coming up, so probably best not to dwell too much on that. I think really what issues this raises is more about what this ruling is going to do for the vegan cause, for the movement, whether it's actually going to help it or hinder it.
OK, so ethical veganism, Gabriel, is that a phrase that you'd ever heard, actually, before this court case? Because it isn't for me.
It's one that I'd heard and could probably guess the definition of, but not one that I know very well.
It seemed to raise the prospect of unethical veganism.
Yeah,
right, exactly. I'm a vegan because what? I'm just lazy? I don't know.
No, but I looked it up, and it's much broader, isn't it? So it's about not just avoiding eating animal products, but also coming into contact with them. So wearing leather shoes. Even some people, including the man who was involved in this tribunal, avoid going in buses or other vehicles because they might collide with insects.
And I think that's why this feeds into this whole thing of it as almost being on a par with a religion, because as this man argues, his veganism dictates all of his everyday choices, and therefore can be described as a codified system of beliefs, whereas perhaps unethical veganism, or whatever you want to call it.
The distinction is against dietary veganism, isn't it? I suppose the point with dietary veganism is some people are vegans for medical reasons or something, possibly even they're trying to save money, I don't know. Whereas obviously, if you're a dietary vegan for ethical reasons, you could still be an ethical vegan, but you'd also have to go that step further in everything you did.
The thing about that, though, is that is that if you call yourself a vegan, then you're automatically linking your practice to food and dietary kind of restrictions and requirements. So if it is something where he avoids hurting or coming into contact with any animals in any part of his life, then call it something else if he doesn't want there to be a backlash.
But that isn't disputed, is it? With Muslims and Jews, you understand that if someone calls themselves, I'm a Muslim or I'm a Jew, that therefore that comes with dietary constraints as well in the form of halal and kosher. That's well established.
The terminology is not quite the same, whereby you'd say, if somebody said to me, I'm a vegan, I'd be like, oh, okay, so you don't eat animal products. If somebody said, I'm a Muslim, I wouldn't be like, oh, those are the people who don't
bacon.
eat pork.
Okay, fair
It's
enough.
like a wider structure of beliefs.
I think what's interesting, particularly about this ruling, is that although it doesn't create a legal binding precedent, this is only the ruling of one tribunal judge in Norwich, the implications for what further claims could come forward. So now could say a vegan supermarket checkout worker refuse to put meat through the tills? At what point do the rights of the individual balance out against the rights of the employer or wider society or beyond?
And that comes down to all kinds of employment discrimination, doesn't it, Holden? The argument is always, well, you've chosen to work here. When you came to work in the supermarket, you knew the supermarket sold meat, so you can't then pull the vegan card, would be the argument. But then, if it's a question about other rights, if it's a question about, well, you came to work for an organisation that's owned by a Christian and therefore he disapproves of your homosexual relationship, that would clearly be discrimination. So this is not always clearly delineated at first.
No, and I think part of the challenge for courts is that these sorts of questions are increasingly coming before them and do need a binary answer. There was another attempt to establish a protected group a couple of months ago involving the think tank researcher Maya Forstater, who is somebody who believes that biological sex is absolute and that trans women aren't real women. And she was taking her employer to court because she said her contract had not been renewed because she had been expressing those views on Twitter. She failed in her attempt. The judge said that protecting her beliefs would undermine existing protection for trans women, and so they didn't meet the test of being suitable for a democratic society. These are always going to be difficult balancing acts of freedom of speech against protecting people from abusive hate speech. Those sorts of questions are not new, but they do seem to be coming in front of courts a lot more often.
There's also this whole case kind of focuses around the pension plan investments of the company for whom this man worked. If this sets a precedent, though, that self-defining ethical vegans around the country working for businesses are allowed to look at the pension plan investments of their employers and see whether or not animals are caused harm by those investments, can we reasonably assume that that does have implications for sort of common and garden employers when the point about this employer was they were involved in an organisation that sought to help animals? That's the nature of the conflict being suggested. It's not saying that every employer needs to look at their pension plans because there's vegans working there.
No, but I suppose it would pave the way for other people to bring cases about other aspects of their employment if they were vegan and they had and they believed that they had been, refused a promotion because they didn't go to a dinner where meat was going to be served, or and it just opens up that legal argument as something that employees could use.
The claimant in this case sort of makes the distinction between there being a positive belief and a negative belief. So also there's that aspect of it. And in fact, there was a 2009 tribunal where a man who strongly held beliefs in climate change, he lost his job after encouraging his bosses to make greener choices. A tribunal actually found in favour because they said that it amounted to a philosophical belief that should be protected against discrimination. And he got a I think about a £42,000 settlement. But the point is, it wasn't challenging anyone's democratic rights, and it was a positive belief. So he could, if he felt he'd been discriminated for expressing that view, then the court ruled that he did have a case. And I suppose with vegans, for example, who were looking at their bosses' pension schemes, I suppose a lot of it comes down to the company's response to that questioning, doesn't it?
But you said earlier that you sense there might be a backlash now against vegans, because people will think, oh, they're troublemakers, those ethical vegans. It seems to me, Gabriel, sort of culturally at the moment, we are in Veganuary after all, vegans are having a real moment. People working for Greggs got a cash boost, didn't they, because of the popularity of their vegan sausage roll. On the way here this morning, I was listening to the Chris Evans Breakfast Show and he was tasting a vegan pie for no reason other than it's an entertaining magazine format point of interest. So actually the cultural conversation seems to be quite in support of veganism at the moment.
That is true, but you will have bad faith, actors who say, oh, will they afford the same rights as me, same rights to me as a carnivore, an omnivore or whatever, and make these kind of very reductive arguments that don't make any sense really, because that's not really what we're discussing. But no, I feel like it's quite... I don't know if it's timely, because it's like veganuary is the ultimate example of where veganism is kind of like not a fad, but it's more of a kind of purely dietary thing, and very much a kind of cultural movement that is kind of comes and goes quite quickly, as opposed to the claimant, who lives a very different life because of a more kind of extreme version of veganism.
With veganism going mainstream, is it really necessary to resort to the law to enforce the rights? Is that just going to put people's backs up? So, Jane Dalton, who is a vegan, in an article for The Independent, says that people are being put off by the shouty self-righteousness of vegans, and she describes using the law to enforce vegans' rights as like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Is it really, by forcing these rights down people's throats, as it were, is that actually just going to alienate people at a time when veganism is losing its associations, with caftan-wearing hippies, and finally people are accepting that it's a lifestyle everyone can embrace if they choose?
One of the ways in which veganism or vegetarianism or just eating less meat has become much more mainstream is because it hasn't seemed as absolute. It's something you can do for a month, or you can do during the week, or you can just aspire towards, and that's fine. And I think what probably has made some people uncomfortable with this case is that in order to establish the legal protection, the lawyer actually had to make veganism seem as out of the mainstream as possible. Like, he had to set it apart as a belief system and make it feel like a religion. In fact, speak about the fact that the man was actively proselytizing and would corner people and try and turn them in. And I think that's perhaps what does get people's backs up, is when they feel under pressure.
That's the thing. You've got this claimant as a figurehead, and he says he won't live with non-vegans, he won't date non-vegans. And, so you've got this really extreme example, which isn't necessarily doing the overall movement a lot of good.
Okay, well, we've had two stories in a row there that are fuel to the fire for the anti-snowflake brigade. Let's see what Gabriel comes up with after this. Okay, last this week, it's Gabriel. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
The 8th plague of the Old Testament has returned to Africa.
Local news footage shows men hollering and banging on pots and plastic bottles as tens of thousands of grasshoppers take to the air. And then heavily armed Kenyan security forces step in. Gunfire doesn't kill many locusts.
This is absolutely useless. It's going to do nothing, in fact.
That was Keith Cressman, Senior Locust Forecasting Officer, amazing, for the United Nations Agricultural Agency, speaking on NPR's All Things Considered. Gabriel, am I right in thinking that was the sound of people shooting locusts?
It was, yeah. So this week, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations announced that the worst outbreak of desert locusts in decades is threatening pastures and crops in East Africa and parts of the Middle East, and could spread further and could cause major, major damage to the food supply of the region.
Okay, so this is a really serious story, and the reaction then of what? Of soldiers, of guerrillas, is to lash out with guns?
It does appear that they've come from the Middle East, or a lot of them have come from the Middle East, and some from Central Asia as well. And they've arrived on the shores of Somalia, and now they're moving into Kenya and Ethiopia and Eritrea. Mm-hmm. And in Somalia, because it's like quite lawless, you had a lot of al-Shabaab militias who actually, through their press arm, their media arm, communicated to reporters that they had started shooting them, as if we were all going to go, wow, what a great idea. And then it turns out that Kenya actually had been doing the same thing with soldiers. So initially they deployed soldiers to go and to shoot them out of the air, and only just in the last couple of days have they decided that that's not the best idea, and are instead going to use what they describe as chemicals, and without much further detail. So yes, it does appear that shooting them was the first point of call, which was mad because there's literally millions of them.
Yeah, but I suppose it shows the sense of panic that this is actually causing, and it is underreported, this, isn't it? So how serious is the problem?
The most recent figures suggest that locusts have already destroyed 70,000 hectares of farmland in Somalia and Ethiopia, and it's being described as the worst locust invasion in 70 years. And they also have the capacity to So in a day, an average swarm will destroy crops sufficient to feed 2,500 people for a year.
Wow.
And they can travel up to 95 miles in a 24-hour period. So they really are a menace.
I mean, you mentioned the biblical reference in your intro to the clip. Obviously, you think of locusts, you think of Moses in Egypt and that sort of thing. Outside of Africa, do we get locusts here, Kari? Are they a thing?
I'm not sure about in Britain, but I know there have been locust invasions in the last few years in Russia, in the US, in Las Vegas and Pakistan. So it's by no means contained to Africa. It's a problem that can affect large swaths of the world.
But they don't swarm, I understand. They're actually quite solitary creatures who then find each other or something. Holden, a locust expert.
I was waiting for this.
Our resident senior
question.
locust forecasting officer. Go ahead.
This is really odd. So locusts, which are also grasshoppers, they have two what's known as phenotypes, which is essentially two forms of behaviour, but forms of behaviour which actually have physical consequences. So you get solitary locusts and you get gregarious locusts. But it's not a sort of stage of life in which one automatically follows the other. A locust could live its entire life as a solitary creature, in which case they cause little harm. They just sort of eat a little bit, and they don't.
Links that to testosterone levels.
Do you know what? It is linked to a hormone, not testosterone. But
I think it's safe to say we're all learning.
And what tends to lead to increased gregariousness is actually overcrowding to begin with. So if you have a long period of drought, which is what has happened across East Africa and the Middle East over the last decade or so, you get concentrations of these young locusts, which are called nymphs or hoppers, two other nice terms I liked. You get concentrations of them in small areas around water. The fact that they are close together, bumping into each other, triggers the release of this hormone, which changes their entire body and the way they behave. And they become these sort of gregarious packs that then start moving from place to place, seeking food and water.
And these swarms are huge. The typical swarm can contain up to 150 million insects. So when they do come together, they really mass.
So how is this being reported in the countries that are being affected, Gabriel? Is it seen as a climate change issue?
In some of the countries it is. I feel like in Kenya it is, and maybe Ethiopia. Kenya's having it worse than Ethiopia. So Somalia really is not really reporting on it a huge amount because it has such a limited infrastructure for the proliferation of news and that sort of thing. And that's also one of the reasons why it's been so badly decimated by this locust outbreak, is because they don't have any infrastructure to act against it. In Kenya, they seem to be treating it more as a political crisis, because I've noticed a number of interviews from MPs in the country who have criticised the government, saying, we've known this is coming for months and months and months. Like, we had so much warning. And look at Ethiopia. They acted on it and they managed to mitigate the worst effects of it. And yet here we are, all of our crops are being eaten, and you're telling us to go out and fire machine guns at the sky. Like, it seems to be causing a lot of frustration among lawmakers in Kenya, certainly, and probably elsewhere.
But experts further afield are saying that the situation has been worsened by climate shocks. Basically, wet, warm conditions are perfect breeding conditions for locusts, and the situation has been massively worsened by heavy rainfall and floods across East Africa that's killed hundreds of people in the past several months. So it's just been this perfect storm of causes, with wars and sanctions on certain pesticides and the effects of climate change.
One of the interesting things is it does seem to have been this real combination of human and natural factors. So this swarm started life in Saudi Arabia, which is where you would naturally find young swarm of locusts. But there was then an unusually long monsoon a couple of years ago, and the winds associated with that happened to push them towards the India-Pakistan border, where A, there's not much cooperation, and B, you can't send up crop dusting aircraft because of the dispute between the two countries. And so that allowed them to breed much more quickly than they otherwise would have done. They were then carried by another storm into Yemen, which again had other focuses rather than pest control. And from there, they then drifted across to East Africa. So all the way, they've benefited both from the original drought and then warmer, wet conditions and the political situations in the areas they happen to have been in.
And what's the main health risk? Is it that they eat the crops and then obviously people starve, or is it that they bite people? I mean, what are the health risks to humans?
No, it's starvation. It's the fact that they destroy crops at an alarming rate. But interestingly, they are destroying crops and thus food supply, But in Yemen or Somalia, and particularly Yemen, they've flipped the whole situation on its head, and they eat the locusts. They'll catch hundreds of them and then eat them in replacement. So obviously
we're using the word locust, but it is interchangeable with grasshopper.
With grasshoppers,
is it? Because that's what I've learned from Holden today. So if we called them grasshoppers, that doesn't sound as frightening because it sounds less biblical.
Yeah.
B, people do eat grasshoppers, don't they, all over the world.
And these ones, I mean, I don't know if it makes me sound a bit naive and city boyish, but these are massive, big things. They look pretty nutritious, and they're also full of protein. And we've been told for years that insect-based diets could be the next thing to A, improve health, and B, fight climate change, which would kind of reverse the entire situation that we currently have going on with the locusts in the Middle East and East Africa.
Apparently, grasshoppers taste like peanuts.
They are also cannibalistic when they're in their gregarious form. They will eat each other if they get the chance. And supposedly that's part of the reason they move as a swarm, because they essentially all want to keep in alignment because their side parts are very vulnerable to attack. So if you have a crowd of locusts all flying in the same direction and one starts to turn its mouth towards the other, it will fear that it's going to be eaten, being the best source of protein around. And so it turns away towards the one next to it, it turns in focus. And so you end up with these huge groups of all moving sort of synchronized like a shoal of fish. And actually one theory has been put forward for control would be to try and disrupt that synchronized movement. So you actually encourage them to all fly in different directions, fly into each other and start eating each other. In practice, this has yet to be developed into an effective form of control, but there has been talk about drones and aircraft being used in that way.
And to go back to what Gabe was saying about people in Somalia, for example, eating them, yes, that's a good solution and that's helping, but Somalia is still facing a massive food crisis. It's already struggling to recover from a severe drought that ended in 2017, and in August, before these locusts really hit, aid agencies were warning that more than 2 million people were threatened with severe hunger. So it can help with the situation, eating the locusts, but there's still a major crisis.
Yeah, it's all very well us sitting in London, isn't it? Saying, oh, well, the insects are eating your crops, don't worry, just eat the insects. I'm sure they'd much rather eat the crops they put aside for that purpose. My thanks to Holden Frith, Kari, Wilkin and Gabriel Power. We are at Week Unwrapped on Twitter if you fancy telling us what you think of this week's show, or if you want to share recipes for gregarious grasshoppers. If you are not subscribed to the show, please feel free to do that now. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week. Bye-bye.